Welcome everybody to Envision Utah's spring event today. Thanks for joining us. My name is Ari Bruning and I'm the CEO of Envision Utah. And I would like to start out by thanking all of our sponsors who've made this event possible. So thank you to Jacobson Construction, to Rocky Mountain Power, Lucid Software, and Hamilton Partners. And thank you as well to all of you who have donated to Envision Utah. And especially thank you to the George S. and Dolores Dory Eccles Foundation for their generous matching grant that makes everybody else's donations go farther. I'd also like to thank Impatient Cow for hosting us today in their studio and broadcasting this event at what we suspect is well below market rate. And it's great to be able to be in studio and have most of our panel here in person. I should mention that most of our panel, in fact, all of those in person are actually on our board. So you're going to get a taste for what an Envision Utah board meeting is like today. At Envision Utah, we look to the future. We create visions or strategic plans for how to keep Utah a great place to live, even as we grow. And a little over 5 years ago, we worked with a number of stakeholders and with the public to create a vision for the future for the state called Your Utah, Your Future. We looked to the year 2050. And we were working hard to implement it. And then the pandemic hit. And you could say that it broke everything. I must say, I never thought I'd get a face mask shaped sunburn line. I never thought I'd say you're on mute at least once a day. And I never thought I'd have to ask my daughter to borrow my own car because she's gotten so used to driving it to school while I've been working from home. And I never thought I'd volunteer to get a shot that would give me a fever for 2 days. On a little more serious note, though, as a community, we never thought as a community that we would see so much disruption, suffering, and change over the last year. And today we're going to be talking about what has the pandemic disrupted, not for today, but for the future. Has it changed our future? And before we get to our panel, I want to talk a little bit more about that Your Utah, Your Future vision that I mentioned. The vision took 2 years of work with the Envision Utah staff working full-time for those 2 years. Over 400 stakeholders were involved and donated countless hours on action teams tackling 11 different topics. We generated scenarios for every one of those topics, and we put that into a survey, took it to the public, and over 52,000 Utahns weighed in. Based on average response times, we figure that Utahns donated about 11,000 hours responding to that survey. And based on the permutations of different combinations of scenarios that you could choose, they could choose from over 1 million different futures. The result was a 35-year vision across 11 topics. So not a 100-day plan or a 500-day plan or a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan, a 35-year plan vision that could inform 100-day plans and 500-day plans and 5-year plans and 10-year plans. And that's what happened. Just to share a few highlights of some of the things that have happened in the last 5 years, largely as a result of that Your Utah, Your Future vision. For air quality, for example, we are now to the point where most of our fuel that we put in our cars is much, much cleaner, which means all of our cars burn cleaner. Every new water heater you get is much, much cleaner than it would have been before. In education, we're seeing historic investments in teachers. We now have a toolbox of strategies that local governments can use to conserve agriculture. We've seen historic state investments in public transportation and in trails. Our housing that we're building, our cities are allowing a wider variety of housing. And a lot of it's being built near public transportation so people can walk to get on a train. These are great things that have happened. The pandemic has changed a lot of things, but these are still great, good things. They're robust strategies that still apply despite all the changes that have happened. That Your Utah, Your Future vision is still a great vision for the state. On the other hand, a lot of things have changed. So we've accelerated a lot of trends. So think about online shopping, for example, or telework, and we're facing some heightened challenges. Think about what's happened to our housing costs, or some sectors of the economy that have been devastated, or we have experienced what a disaster looks like now. And this won't be our last disaster, so we're motivated to get ready for the next one. So as we're thinking about this, we're asking ourselves, can we take advantage of some of these changes that have happened so that instead of going back to the way things were, if that's even possible, we go forward into a new future that's better. So think about a few examples. One of those, think about telework, for example. We've seen the power of telework in helping with congestion, air quality, has potential for rural economic development. So what can we do to harness that trend? By the way, if you're interested in your business teleworking during bad air quality times, we'd love to talk to you. We're having a discussion about that. Think as another example, think about biking. Biking has been at record highs. So can we keep that trend going? That'll help with community health, air quality, traffic congestion, quality of life. So what can we do to continue to make sure biking is convenient and safe? And then maybe as another example, think about online shopping. That's a threat to the health of our brick and mortar retail, which could be threatening to a municipality's revenue, but it's also an opportunity. It opens up a lot of land where we can create mixed use centers where you can live, work, and play in the same place. And that benefits everybody. Again, a lot of the same benefits of air quality, congestion, and quality of life, and so forth. So as we think about these new challenges and opportunities, it's time to refresh that Your Utah, Your Future vision that we worked so hard on to deal with the new opportunities and challenges, create new momentum for implementation. So stay tuned in the coming months. We'll begin this process, and we hope you'll be involved, serve on a stakeholder committee, take a survey, whatever you can do to help us out. So today, as you listen to this panel, we'll be talking about what the future will look like or could look like. And we want you to ask yourself, in light of the changes that are coming, what should we be doing as a state and as a people to make sure that these changes happen in the best way possible so that the future can be the brightest that it can be for all of us? Now, before I kick it to the panel, a few logistical things. If you took the survey before the event, thank you. We've looked at all your responses, and we have included a lot of the suggestions in terms of priorities of topics to cover and what questions we could include. We can't include all of your questions. We wish we could. Now, during the event, if there's a question you'd like to see addressed, feel free to use the Zoom Q&A feature, and we will include as many of those questions as we can. So with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator today, Doug Wright, who many of you know from his being on the radio for decades. He's known as the most trusted man in Utah, and he also happens to be the chair of the Envision Utah board. So with that, Doug.
Thank you, Ari. And it's a real pleasure to be here today. We have a great panel ready to field some very, very interesting and some very tough questions over the next little while. And among these four individuals, it's really quite incredible the talent that we have marshaled for this event. Expertise in economics and housing and real estate, transportation, city planning, recreation, demographics, climate change policy, and undoubtedly you'll notice even more expertise as our conversation moves forward. And so let's get right to it and introduce our just amazing panel today. And we start with Natalie Gochnour. And Natalie is the Associate Dean of the David Eccles School of Business and the Director of the Kem C. Gardner Policy Institute at the University of Utah. Natalie's also the Chief Economist for the Salt Lake Chamber. Her Policy Institute, they have studied everything from climate change, housing policies. They prepare economic, demographic, and public policy research that helps our state, our great state of Utah, prosper. And in fact, just this morning, they released a new report about some disparities here in our great state. And Natalie herself has a diverse mix of expertise ranging from public service to business. She's advised 3 of Utah's past governors. She has served as an associate administrator at the EPA, has authored over 250 published columns in Utah Business Magazine and in the Deseret News. So it's a real honor to have Natalie with us today. And we'll also introduce you to Nico Larco. Now, Nico is joining us today from Portland, Oregon, the only member of our panel that's not here in studio with us. Nico is a professor of architecture and urban design at the University of Oregon. He's also the director of the Urbanism Next Center and co-director of the Sustainable Cities Institute. At Urbanism Next Center, he focuses on how technology advances, such as new mobility, and sharing economy, how this is all changing our city and the city forms and our development. Nico has run workshops nationally and internationally on the topic of future proofing and is currently coordinating work in this area with various municipal and state agencies across North America and even in Europe. Nico also researches sustainable urban design and has developed the Sustainable Urban Design Framework. So Nico, thank you for joining us as well. Our third panelist today is on our spring breakfast, which isn't really a breakfast, but kind of a lunch break for everybody. Taylor Mammen is the Chief Executive Officer of RCLCO Fund Advisors. And for those who might not know, RCLCO Fund Advisors advises institutional investors on all aspects of their complex real estate investment portfolios, from strategy development to underwriting and, of course, asset management. Taylor helped pioneer this business beginning in the aftermath of the global financial crisis and has grown it to become highly respected an institutional real estate advisor working with some of the largest and most dynamic institutional investors in the world. Now, Taylor was actually raised in Utah, but he spent most of his career in Los Angeles, although thanks to the pandemic, he's currently been staying in Park City, seeing that through. And finally, we're very honored to have the Speaker of the House of the great state of Utah, Representative Brad Wilson, with us. He represents District 15 in the Utah State Legislature, has now for a decade. Now, as I mentioned, is our Speaker. He's the president and CEO of Destination Homes, a residential home builder here in our great state. He's also a member of the Utah chapter of the Young Presidents Organization and has chaired the Davis Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors, the Davis Economic Advisory Council, and Children's Aid Society here in the state of Utah. Brad happens to be a Davis County native and lives there with his wife, Jenny, and 3 children in Kaysville, Utah. And again, a big thanks to all of our panelists for joining us today. And as Ari already mentioned, we'd love to get some questions from you as well. Unfortunately, we can only handle a few, but we would love through the chat or whichever device you choose, we'd love to maybe select some of those questions. But to start, we've given each of our panelists an opportunity to make an opening statement, kind of set the stage, but that will be based on a theme that Ari also mentioned a little earlier. The pandemic has already changed so much in our lives. How has it changed Utah's long-term future? And we'd like to start with a brief opening statement from Natalie Gochnour.
Thanks so much, Doug. Great to be with all of you today. I'm just going to tee this off by just thinking about this in the way that I think of it. You know, we've been through this pandemic and we're asking the question, what happens afterwards? And really everybody that looks at that says, there's 3 things we ought to be thinking about, right? Is it just a reset and we go right back to where we were? Second, is it an acceleration of trends that were already in play? Or third, is it really a completely different world post-pandemic? And I'd like to suggest to all of you that it's a little bit of all 3. Let's make it complicated. But, you know, if I look at something like Utah's declining fertility rates, that's been happening for a while. I expect that to continue happening. And we'll just go right back to where we were in that case. On the second point of an acceleration of trends, there's no question that the idea of online education, remote learning has taken hold, and there's something there that's been accelerated. Something that we were already moving towards, particularly in higher education, but something that we'll look at differently moving forward. And on the idea of just completely new things post-pandemic, here we have to think about structural changes in the economy that will be with us for a long, long time. Usually those are demographic changes, technological changes, but in this case, I'm speaking specifically about changes in consumer preferences, behavioral changes that will stick with us. And I can't think of anything better to highlight there than the idea that we've all learned that we can work in a variety of locations. And as we change where we want to work, where our preferences are to work, that changes a whole bunch of different things moving forward. And so the combination of all these changes makes it a very different world post-pandemic.
Great. Thank you, Natalie. And let's go back to Portland, Oregon, and we're going to check in with Nico Larco. Okay, perhaps we could go to Nico in just a moment. Why don't we move ahead and perhaps we can throw it down to Taylor Mammen, and then we'll go to Nico in just a moment.
Yeah, happy to jump in, and very happy to be here this morning. As Doug mentioned up front, I live in Los Angeles. I've spent most of my career there, but born and bred in Utah, and staying here during the pandemic. Thank you, Utah, for your hospitality while we're here. And as I've gotten vaccinated, as my family and friends have gotten vaccinated, we've had the chance to get together, and it's been wonderful to do that. But I'll tell you, the things that I hear about, well, of course, after hearing about the obligatory pandemic-related discussions, complaints, and vaccine side effects, the discussions that I hear about are very similar to what I've heard about for a long time when I come home to Utah and talk about the things that are on people's minds. Going a little to Natalie's points about what stays the same, and two things that are coming back post-pandemic and are likely to continue and are very frequent topics of every conversation are, of course, as you all know, the cost of housing, specifically how expensive it is, and traffic. And the conversations often go to ideas about what can we do about these things, what solutions people have, and everybody has their ideas about how we can address these things. And then sometimes they turn to me and ask for my so-called expert opinion. And because I have nothing to lose on the subject, I oftentimes just simply say nothing. There's nothing that you can do about these things, or at least you don't want to know or pursue those things that would actually address the cost of housing as well as traffic in the way that a lot of people are thinking about it, which is to go back to some past that is unlikely ever to be feasible in Utah again. It's going to be unlikely that an entry-level home will be single family with a yard and so on. It'll be unlikely that anybody will be able to commute at 60 to 70 miles per hour and be able to live in one county and go to another with any kind of reasonable commuting distance. So you can really just move forward, and I'll describe some of the reasons why these conditions are unlikely to appear in Utah in the future, and why you don't want them. And the first is that Utah has tapped into global economic drivers. The primary driver of the global economy and the US economy in the 21st century is the digital economy. Not a surprise to anybody. This economy is growing at 2 times the rate of the national economy. And it's here in Utah. There's a far greater share of jobs in the digital economy in the Wasatch Front than there are in the nation as a whole. And that's of course of great benefit to many residents of Utah, and could potentially be a great benefit to all residents of Utah as well. And that has led to significant growth. The chart that I'm showing on the screen describes the employment growth between 2010 and 2020 for the largest metropolitan statistical areas, economic regions in the country. And you can see the Wasatch Front at the very top of that list, growing faster on a percentage basis than pretty much any other part of the country. Of course, the numbers might be larger in larger economies such as Dallas and Phoenix, but Utah's growing the fastest, and you're certainly feeling that at this point. And that has attracted the attention of global capital, which is a fuel that continues to drive this growth. What I'm showing on the screen here is the NPI index, which is an index of institutional real estate investments. So the investments made by the largest real estate funds and organizations on the planet, essentially. So, and what you can see is that the share of the NPI of this index, I should say Salt Lake City's share of this index, has grown over 3 times since the second half of 2016. That's truly dramatic growth, an indicator of how interested global capital is in investing in Utah. And that capital has been very well rewarded, as you can see on the right here, that these real estate investments in the United States have returned far greater returns than those in the nation as a whole, which is only going to attract more interest from these investors. And all of that generates the growth that we've all seen and talked about and benefited from and suffer from and so on. And it only continues growing forward. So our projections as a firm are that there will be 20,000 new housing units per year on average. It'll of course fluctuate more than what it looks like in this chart in the Wasatch Front over the next, call it 30 to 40 years. As you can see, that development will likely be denser than what it has in the past, again, largely because of a lot of these affordability issues, potentially some demographic changes as well, with a large segment of that being both townhomes and small lot single family units, as well as condos and apartments. And it's interesting, even if you assume that growth in the future appropriately is denser than growth in the past, that potentially consumes 140 square miles of land between now and 2050. That's about the same size, a little smaller than the land areas of Salt Lake City and Provo today. So significant. That's a significant amount of land that the market will likely want to consume, and the state has a choice of how it consumes it. And the area in which that development, in particular, a lot of the employment is taking place, is shifting as well. As historically, over the last 20 years, the development of jobs has taken place primarily toward the south, in southern Salt Lake County, as well as northern Utah County. That's likely to continue, though with the amount of growth that we're talking about, we're likely to see new employment clusters, cores emerge both south and north, and potentially east and west. But again, those are the decisions that the residents of Utah, both public sector as well as private sector, will make, and look forward to discussing those further. So back to you, Doug.
A little food for thought right there amongst our two opening comments. We have two more to go, and I think we do have some of our technical glitches worked out as we take you back to Portland, Oregon, and Nico, Larco.
It's a pleasure to be here and really talk about the future of what's happening in Utah, trends we see right now, and what might happen, as we look much further in the future. As was mentioned, I'm the Director of Urban Next here at the University of Oregon, and what we do is we look at the impacts of emerging technologies, so self-driving cars, autonomous vehicles, new mobility, so everything that is like Lyft, Uber, microtransit, all those types of things, and e-commerce on cities. We focus less on the technologies themselves than we do on the thing that's at the bottom there. How is it going to affect the built environment, the way we live, where we live, all these types of things. We've developed something called the Urbanism Next framework, which helps to organize a lot of these topics, and we invite you to urbanismnext.org to look at these. And what I really want to look at right now is just some of the things that we've been looking at in recent trends that are going to be having substantial impact, we think, on how we develop in cities. One of those that was mentioned earlier by Natalie as well is just the incredible growth of online shopping. So there's definitely been a boom. There you can see in 2018, in the second quarter, we were just right about 10% of total shares of retail were online. The pandemic accelerated our trends, by 5, 6, 7 years. So in the second quarter of 2020, that was around 16%. That's come down a little bit, and part of that is just that brick and mortar shopping came up a little bit. But we're still, we've advanced this trend tremendously. So again, in relation to what Natalie was saying, this is an acceleration of an existing trend. That whole shift to online, the closing of brick and mortar stores, the shift to experiential retail, all that is just going much, much faster. And for a lot of this, the cat's out of the bag. It's going to be really hard to go back to some of these other ways of shopping that we used to have. In terms of another kind of interesting trend is this question of, will people live in cities? And there's been a lot of, right at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a whole lot of discussion of, everyone's moving out of cities, and a lot of different analyses of that. What you actually found was that in most places, people weren't moving out of cities. What you were seeing was a lot of people moving out of the most expensive cities. So New York and San Francisco were seeing enormous trends of moving out, but the rest of the country was more or less staying stable. Now that we've gone through the pandemic quite a bit, there's more data, and what we can see, and this is interesting here, is an analysis by the Federal Reserve. That top blue line, the heavy blue line, is the urban outmigration, 4-quarter moving average, and the bottom line is an urban in-migration, 4-quarter moving average. And what you see that's really interesting is that you're not seeing an exodus of a lot of people leaving cities, or more people leaving cities than we've typically seen. What you see is a lot of people not moving into cities, right? So the real change has been the people coming into cities. And of that drop that you're seeing, more than half of it can be explained by people who are 18 to 34 years old. In other words, younger people are not moving into cities during the pandemic. That does not seem like much of a surprise, but it also makes us wonder about what the long-term effects of this are going to be. It's very possible as soon as cities have things to offer that we can actually, spend time, see people, have all the cultural events, all the reasons we love living in the cities, that when that happens, this whole demographic is going to shift back going into cities. So I'm not sure about the whole narrative that seems to be a whole lot in the media of like this being the end of cities. In fact, I think quite the opposite. A really interesting trend that we absolutely all have to be paying attention to is working from home. We've all been experimenting with that, if we wanted to or not. Right now, as of March, this is from from Bureau of Labor Statistics, 21% of the US labor force is working from home, which is obviously not the majority of the population, but is also much larger than it was before the pandemic. The question is how much of this is going to continue. But one of the things that's kind of hidden in this is that is for the entire country, the entire labor force. As we look at cities, things look really different. So for instance, this is in New York City office workers, 84% are working from home. So we could see a really big shift if we were to just look at urban areas or office work, tremendous shift in the amount of workers that are working from home and who's going to be continuing. We just saw news this last week. The Google yesterday released statements saying that 20% of their workforce is going to be able to work from home permanently. Another 60% is now going to be working from home 2 days a week. So in the office 3 days a week, and from home 2 days a week. So these are enormous shifts in how we live and where we live and how we move around. Another really big question related to this, which I think will mean a lot for different areas of Utah, is this question of flattening the curve, and not so much flattening the curve for the things we've talked about with the pandemic, but more flattening the curve of when peak traffic is happening. One of the things that you see with work from home and even the ability to make Zoom meetings happen and the flexibility that gives you is that there's going to be a lot less people traveling in those peak times, especially those morning peaks. And so what you see is a much flatter curve across the board, which means that that really changes commute patterns. It doesn't necessarily change the amount that we're traveling because people who are working from home are still traveling a good amount. They're just not doing it at the same time. But huge questions then for how we invest in infrastructure. Where is it people are going to want to live? Where they're going to be spending their time? I invite you to take a look at urbanismnext.org. We do a lot of reports on these topics, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. I'll send it back then.
Thank you, Nico. And now our final opening statement will come from the Speaker of the House here in the state of Utah, Representative Brad Wilson.
Thank you, Doug. It is a pleasure to be here. I also thank Ari for the invitation and his opening comments. I don't want to get us off on the wrong foot, but I'm actually going to disagree with something that Ari said at the beginning. He said that the pandemic broke everything, and it did dang near break everything. But one of the things that I think we're all heartened about is that it really didn't break Utah, and it didn't break the spirit of the people here in Utah. And let me just give you some perspective on that. I was driving down the road the other day and got a call from the Speaker of the House of another state. I won't mention who it is, a Midwestern state, curious about how come things were going and are going so well in Utah. And we talked for a while and shared some ideas back and forth. But he said to me how remarkable it was that our state navigated the last year. And I think we did, primarily because we have really good people and we tried to balance things in the right way. But we also talked about this notion, and I wanted to just share with you maybe a framework as I think about the next 2 or 3 decades here in Utah. There was an admiral in the Navy, James Stockdale. Jim Collins sort of made this a big part of his book, Good to Great, where he talked about the Stockdale paradox. And at the end of the day, this notion that he elevated was that prisoners of war who did the worst during difficult times were those that were always optimistic and thought everything was always going to turn out great and they were going to be taken care of tomorrow. Those that seemed to do the very best during really difficult and challenging times were those that did what I'll describe as radically accepted the reality that they were in. And Utah, I think last year and even today, kind of radically has accepted the truth as to where we're at. But when I think about the next 2 or 3 decades, the Stockdale paradox comes into play for us as a state. And let me just mention 2 things. The first is we have passed the point of no return in terms of the growth of this state. The secret is out. We are going to continue to be a rapidly growing state, and our state will forever look and feel different than it has in the past. And secondly, there is a force or forces that are bearing down on this state that we just have to radically accept. We have a declining fertility rate. We historically have been very dependent on some of the demographic underpinnings here in Utah, high volunteerism, a very different sort of racial makeup than we're going to have in the future. And things are going to look different in Utah over the next 2 or 3 decades. And the sooner we really understand the opportunities that these changes are going to create for the state, as well as some of the challenges, especially the growth challenges, I think the better off we're going to be. So I'm excited to hear what we have to say, Doug.
It'll be most interesting, thank you, Speaker Wilson, to follow up on these opening statements. And boy, I'm debating because we have the new normal and our future normal as our second topic. But based on what I've heard in comments from each of our panelists, we'll deal with kind of the nuts and bolts of growth. But I'm really curious, based on what we have heard, some of the presentations that have been made, what is, and everybody's using a different term for it, you know, is it the new normal? Is it going back to normal? Is it the future normal? But how radical are we going to change? And what will some of the most significant changes be? I'd like to throw this out to the entire panel, but maybe Taylor, I could start with you. I know so many, and my kids and others are going, well, we're just going to have to wait till this housing bubble bursts and wait for the prices to go down and so on. Based on your comments, it sounds like that could be a healthy wait.
Yeah, and of course, the housing market, as all markets, fluctuate based upon a lot of different factors, including interest rates and things like that. So it's certainly possible that it'll be easier to buy a home in the future than it is today. It may be cheaper even as well. But the general condition that I was describing likely endures for a while is really the point that I was trying to make, in that the base level of housing never goes back to where it was in the 1980s, 1990s. And that likely means that housing consumers might have to make different choices than their parents did, either drive a lot further than their parents might have in order to find a place that they can qualify to purchase, or choose a different type of housing, whether it's owner or renter or higher density or something like that. We're already seeing the market make those types of decisions in Utah today. And that's simply because not only is Utah growing very rapidly, it's a supply constrained place. You look at Utah and it's a lot like a coastal market that is constrained by bodies of water or mountains. Utah has both. It has a significant bodies of water. It also has mountains that constrain development, creating both limited land to develop close to where the jobs are today, as well as choke points that create challenges for infrastructure as well. So those are the types of issues that Utah will have to wrestle with going forward in order to make sure that everybody is housed.
What about commercial real estate? And maybe I can throw that out to our panel again in general. Natalie, maybe I could throw that to you. You and I have talked about this before. What is the future for commercial real estate? And if, as was pointed out, in New York, we have such a huge number of people that normally are filling those big, tall buildings and they're working from home, how many of them are going to go back? And especially when we look at that here in the state of Utah.
You know, Doug, as in all things, it all comes down to, is the commercial real estate, is it competing? Is it creating value? Is it attractive in the marketplace? And I think we're very fortunate in Utah, in the capital city, to have these incredible downtown projects that are paid for and under construction right now. And I think they'll do quite well. But moving forward, we do have to ask questions, right? If the workforce is working at home 2 to 3 days a week, does that change the demand side of the equation for commercial real estate in office buildings? I think it does. Moving forward, if we have fewer hotels than we otherwise would have because of less business travel, hotel classifies as commercial real estate. If we have fewer hotels, that changes things a bit. So I think this is a very alive and active conversation, and I'm sure Speaker Wilson, Taylor, Nico would have more to say about it.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, maybe I could throw it to you, and we look at downtown Salt Lake City, you look at the radical changes we're seeing in the 2 major malls that we have downtown. We've seen some of the more out in the neighborhoods, we've seen some of those malls just flat closed down. Where are we going, especially in that area?
Well, I think, Doug, that our growth as a state will probably cover up some of the disruption that these commercial real estate markets are seeing. I think we're going to be in a better spot than a lot of states that aren't growing as fast as we are. But there is no doubt that people's preferences for work has changed. I think that this notion of a work week where it's sort of this 3-2-2 strategy, you work 3 days at the office, you work 2 days at home, and you have 2 days off. I think that's going to be a very, very common rhythm for a lot of people moving forward. And that is going to be a big disruption across the state. I will also say this, I think that many of us have realized through the pandemic that we need a little bit less formality in the way we do our work. We actually kind of embrace at times being able to do telecommuting and want the ability to have a little bit more flexibility, a lot less tolerance to drive from one place to the next for a meeting. And on my way here, I literally pulled over and did a meeting with 4 other people in my truck on a pretty important state issue. And so, I mean, it's just, that's a new thing that 2 years ago, you never would have thought you could do. So
let's get a response from Nico. I'd be curious to have you chime in on this with your expertise in especially some of these urban issues.
Yeah, so definitely the shift in commercial real estate, I think absolutely we're seeing a softening of demand that's happened throughout the pandemic. And as people look forward, it's a place I think that there's the biggest question. The other really big question is in kind of retail, like how much real estate we need for malls, strip malls, all these types of things. And all that it was already waning before the pandemic because we were shifting to e-commerce. You're seeing that even more. The place that you're seeing tremendous growth, which I'm assuming you're seeing that all over Utah as well, is a huge demand for warehousing. As we shift from retail to e-commerce, from brick and mortar retail to e-commerce, there's more of a need for warehousing, the more of a need for warehousing very close to consumers. So you're seeing a lot more warehousing happening in residential communities. So you can have the 1 and 2 hour delivery. That really changes the balance of things. One thing that I wanted to mention, which I think Utah should be tremendously excited about, is that as we are entering this period of tremendous changes, right? Huge shifts that are happening. The places that are going to do best are the places that have high growth. And the reason they're going to be able to do the best is that they're going to be able to change and move with the changes that are coming at them, right? They can react to those things. Places with low growth kind of are stuck with whatever infrastructure and patterns they have, patterns of development that they have, and hope that the changes that are happening, what's shutting down and what's new opening up, can somehow work with that. In Utah, you have a tremendous opportunity because of all the growth. What's really important, however, is that you need to make sure that you're paying attention to the trends that are coming at you, that you're rebalancing, thinking about what you're zoning for instance, or where it is that you're building, and that you make decisions that maintain flexibility in infrastructure, where investment's going to happen into the future, so that you can be nimble depending on what changes are happening.
We just got some census data, some of the first dump of that data, and people have been analyzing it and looking at it. We're not going to get an additional congressional seat, but it does indicate that Utah is growing very, very quickly. A lot of people, when there's a lot of growth in a state, and especially when the housing prices are going up and there are difficult circumstances, they tend to go, oh, it's all these outsiders that are coming into the state of Utah. Natalie, I remember when you were with Governor Leavitt, that was a topic that came up often on Let Me Speak to the Governor, and often in private conversations. And the governor at that time and governors since have pointed out that most of our growth is homegrown. Is that still the case, Natalie?
Well, it was really fun to see the census numbers last week. It is an enumeration, right? It's 100% count of our state, and we got our numbers. And not only were we the fastest growing state in the country, growing by 18.4% over a decade, but we did learn that 65% of that growth is from ourselves. That's what we call natural increase, births minus deaths. And that's roughly equivalent to what our state has done over the past decades, about 2/3 from ourselves. But I will remind the viewers that in any given year that changes. And there's times when it's 50-50. And in the last few years, it's been closer to 50-50. And that's because we've been such an attractive place to be. And I think the speaker's absolutely correct. Growth is Utah's constant companion. It gives us tailwinds as we go through, changes, because it gives us a little bit more room to breathe as we're doing things. But it also creates an enormous challenge. And if this state does not invest, and doesn't invest massively in infrastructure, in education, in the needs that growth puts on us, then our growth will not be the kind of growth that we want, and eventually would lead to decline.
Maybe, Mr. Speaker, you could also address that, heading, the entire House here in the state of Utah, one of our state leaders. How do you envision the growth? Where is it going? What effect is it going to have on the state? The biggest pluses, the biggest minuses?
Well, we've seen, at least retrospectively, that the majority of the growth is happening on the Wasatch Front, and we expect that will likely continue. And our paradigm and sort of the lens that at least I look at this issue through is very akin to what Natalie just described. We have been so fortunate here in the state of Utah to have a quality of life and an experience raising families and starting businesses here that's been very conducive to success. And how do we, as policymakers, ensure that all those ingredients, that the recipe that we've had in the past continues to be our recipe? And growth is great. I mean, if you're not growing, you're in trouble. But unsustainable growth is problematic, and so we're trying to figure out exactly what that looks like, and put in front of the state the infrastructure that Natalie talked about, but also protect the things, at least as best as we can as elected officials, the elements that also lead to a great quality of life, like recreation assets and infrastructure, so we have a place to go with our families and enjoy the outdoors, for example. So those are some of the things that we're really concerned about and investing heavily in. And then the last thing I will say that concerns me a lot, and I alluded to this earlier about the kind of shift in demographics that we're seeing. Education is so important. I don't think any of us would say it's not our most important resource that we need to be investing in. And we've put record amounts of money in education over the last couple of years, but we've got to stay really focused on significant investment and significant innovation in both public and secondary education, so that we are investing in the most important thing that our growth brings to us, and it's the people side of things.
Maybe we could also have Nico and Taylor weigh in on this. Nico, maybe I could throw it to you next. When you are dealing with, and now we're talking about, the fastest growing state in the union, and it's interesting too, the three of the fastest growing states are right here. If I recall, it's Nevada, and it's Idaho, and it's Utah, and then we have Texas, and I think it's North Dakota or South Dakota? North Dakota, yeah. Exactly. So right here in the Intermountain West, Utah does not have the exclusivity. What effect does that have when you're planning an urban environment, Nico?
That is an excellent question, and I think the speaker has said it perfectly, which is growth is not a problem. Unsustainable growth is really the problem. I think one of the big questions for Utah is thinking about what the urban form has been up to now. If you were to double that, what happens to the state? Well, one, those 140 miles that we're talking about before, 140 square miles, that is a lot of space that probably is very difficult to find in areas where you want growth to be happening right now. And the second part is, does doubling the population of the state mean that we're doubling the expanse of the cities, right? If you're planning on growing through sprawl, you are in for a whole host of headaches in terms of transportation, land consumption, natural resource consumption, all the traffic that's going to be generated from that, and the quality of life that's going to come with that. So really trying to figure out a way that you grow that next 100% growth in a way that's sustainable, that allows for people to have high quality of life, that allows for many transportation options, that allows for denser housing is probably part of this, that allows for mixes of transportation options. I think that's the key question to make sure that pay attention to, so you don't run into, I know one of the big issues over there is land and air quality issues. This is probably the number one question, the number one decisions that will affect that.
David, could I ask you to quickly chime in on this as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And Natalie's comments reminded me of an experience I had just a few weeks ago. I was on a quad chairlift at the ski resort with a friend and some new acquaintances, all men about my age, and we were all talking. Some had returned to Utah to work after working elsewhere, and all of us were commenting how much the economy in Utah has changed since when we graduated from local universities here. I certainly felt at that time that in order to pursue the type of job I wanted to have, I'd have to leave the state. These other young men did as well, but they've said that's changed entirely at this point. This is a place where you can be homegrown, and there are plenty of great jobs to serve those that are graduating from the universities. And those types of things don't happen by accident. That's a remarkable transformation over a relatively limited amount of time. And it goes to what the speaker was saying about education and the importance that education has in attracting great employers and great jobs, and creating great employers and great jobs, and the partnerships that are unique in Utah. That's one thing that I've observed looking at and working in different states, is that Utah has a unique way of bringing multiple different parties together to talk about some of these difficult issues in forums like Envision Utah that simply don't exist in other places. And so other states try to replicate what Utah is doing, but really have a harder time doing it. And so these types of organizations are really critical going forward to be able to wrestle with the challenges, the very specific challenge that Nico mentioned. Where are we going to put 20,000 houses a year, and ensure that the areas that we love continue to be preserved for recreation, and traffic doesn't just get worse and worse and worse. And I'm confident Utah can take that up, as they've taken up challenges in the past.
You've heard the comments already refer to education. I don't know how many times. We would be remiss if we didn't do a quick roundtable on education, where we are seeing things going. This is something that Envision Utah has been heavily invested in, and some very interesting things have come to light as we have looked much closer at education. And I can't help but tap into this expertise. We didn't have that as an isolated topic, but I'd like to throw that around very quickly. And perhaps, Mr. Speaker, we could start with you. You were the first one to really mention education, so I'm going to let you be the first to go.
Well, there's been and it's probably happened a little bit under the radar, that there's been a really significant change in the way we fund public education in the state over the last year. And the voters approved a constitutional amendment to give the legislature some different tools to manage the state budget. But also with that, we've said moving forward for public education, we're going to fund it in a much more predictable and a consistent way. And we did that this last legislative session with a record increase in public education. And interestingly enough, earlier this week, I received a text from my sister-in-law who teaches second grade up in Kaysville. And she said, "Brad, I just saw the compensation package that the district is looking at for next year. I can't thank you enough." And that's heartening to me to see that some of the investment that we're making in our educators and in our public education system is actually kind of getting that water to the end of the row, because one of the most important elements in education is attracting great and retaining great teachers. There's much more to it than that. And one of the challenges I think our education system is going through right now is how do they harness the disruption that COVID has created in their world, and do it in a way that really kind of propels them into some new innovative ways to deliver education to students. But it is something that's really important here in the state. And the other thing that's happening right now that we're sort of still in the middle of is we've changed the way we are governing and also funding our public universities. And so that book hasn't been completely written yet, but we're doing a lot of things there that will bring the system together in a much more collaborative way and hold these institutions to really high standards of accountability to deliver the right outcomes for students, so that when students are graduating, they're doing it in a quick way. And like Taylor said, they're doing it in a way that they're going to a great job and a great opportunity here in the state.
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad you mentioned COVID, because I've wondered what long-term effect that's going to have on education and what kind of lessons perhaps have been learned. And maybe, as tough as this has all been, maybe even some good lessons that have been learned. And Taylor, maybe you can quickly chime in and we'll go around through our panel.
Yeah, absolutely. And quick, just to follow up on the speaker's comments, as I was pointing out before, one of the primary drivers of growth and economic growth, specifically in Utah and the Wasatch Front, is the digital economy, and that's a segment of the economy that requires educated workers to be able to fulfill the jobs there, and that's the segment of the economy that generates the wealth, new capital, essentially, that then gets spread around through all of the additional industries and necessary jobs in the region. And so in order for Utah to continue to tap into that significant engine, it's necessary to ensure that it's supplying the workers to be able to support it. And just in terms of COVID, really quickly, I'm speaking pretty personally here that, one of the things that I think Utah did right, and I think took pretty significant risks in doing, was to keep the schools open during COVID. I know that was a controversial decision, and being from Los Angeles, which made a very different decision, I'm far more worried about particularly underserved communities in places like Southern California, and the fact that they haven't actually been in school for a year. And the long-term implications of that than I am for the school children in Utah. My nieces and nephews and so on that have been in school consistently for most of this year. And I think that both Utah as well as other states are going to have to figure out how to maybe reinvest or increase investments for the kids that maybe have fallen behind. I'm sure there are some that are here and everywhere, in order to make sure that they're able to qualify for the employment opportunities in the future, however many years down the road, those opportunities, they'll be looking for those types of opportunities.
Thank you, Taylor. Let's go up to Portland and get a reaction from Nico on this in the urban environment.
Yeah, well, I think the thing that I can speak most to is the university environment. I think everything that's been said is absolutely true. It has been a categorical shift in terms of what's possible. So I don't believe that we're going to continue on in online education forever, but we've seen that online education is possible. I think we were all in shock at how well so much of this worked. So the opportunity to bring in talent from all sorts of places, to train talent from all sorts of places, I think has really grown. And I think we're going to be seeing a big shift in the next 5 and 10 years of what higher education looks like, and a mixing of in-person, hybrid, and kind of remote education happening through that.
When the speaker came into the studio a little earlier, he mentioned that we could spend 4 hours talking about these topics and probably much more, but I really do appreciate the input that we're getting. And Natalie, I'd like you to give us a little input on where we stand in education.
Happy to do that, Doug. When I think of this, I'm thinking of something that George Herbert Walker Bush said. I don't remember the quote exactly, but he basically said, when you've got public policy challenges and you try to look at the root cause or things that you can do to make them better, inevitably you'll find yourself at education. And there's a really good reason for that, because you have to grow an economy, to prosper, you have to take a lower value input and create a higher value output. We do that in physical capital by investing roads, bridges, the things, equipment, but we have to invest in people. We have to invest in human capital. And when we do that, great things happen for that person and for society at large. And so if you're looking at intergenerational poverty or racial and ethnic disparities or homelessness, if you're looking at these things, eventually you'll look at education and remember how important it is. And then just to be honest, it is a role of our state to do that. So it's a very important part of the solution to all of these challenges.
We obviously have gone through a challenge that nobody had anticipated. I remember the very last live interview, face-to-face interview I did with then, he was at that point the lieutenant governor of the state of Utah, candidate for governor, Spencer Cox. I remember I asked, well, what do you think's going on? And he indicated that he had talked with our former governor and the former head of Health and Human Services and at the national level. And he said, I talked with former Governor Leavitt, and this gives indications that this could be the one, is how he mentioned it. As Utah prepares for the unforeseen, we always, and here at Envision Utah, this is a very, very big topic and a very big concern of ours. Are we prepared for earthquakes? Are we prepared for some of the natural disasters? And then we have a pandemic. And ironically, we had both. In the last year, we had the earthquake and we had, or the last year plus, earthquake and pandemic and other challenges as well. Are we adequately prepared here in the state of Utah? Are we dedicating enough money, enough resources to make sure that we are prepared to whatever degree is humanly possible for some of these challenges? And Natalie, perhaps I could throw that back to you.
Well, that's a big question. Are we prepared for challenges? I think our state prides itself on having planning in our DNA. It's part of our ethos, if you will. I mean, Envision Utah is a testament of that. I've been involved with Envision Utah since 1996, and I've watched as the community has used a public-private partnership to think long-term and to, really engage and, foster solutions to these challenging things. Are we prepared? I think we're as prepared as any other state in the country. Could we do more? Absolutely. We can always do more to be prepared for the future. And I think that's why forums like this are very important.
Mr. Speaker, it was just 2 years ago that at an Envision Utah breakfast that we were talking about earthquakes, natural disasters, and we handed out fortune cookies to everybody that would reflect what the likely scenario would be. How many people would be without certain resources, how many people would be injured, how many people, and we somehow, you got the one, you were the person that died in that disaster several years ago. But looking at as a state leader, somebody who has his hands on the reins and even the purse strings of the state, are we doing enough?
Well, by the way, I don't think that was an accident. That I was the one that was killed off during the big one. I think it was by design. But so I would say, kind of just to echo what Natalie said, I mean, we're probably as prepared as anyone, but I'm not sure that's a very high standard, to be honest. So I think there's two things that we have to think about. It's impossible to predict with a lot of accuracy exactly how natural disasters will show up and what the dynamics of those will look like. But there's no doubt that we need to do more to be thoughtful and plan and prepare for natural disasters in the state. And as our climate continues to be very challenging, fires are becoming a much bigger and bigger concern for the state. Of course, earthquakes is what we think about often in natural disasters. So we as a legislature are actually getting ready for a special session in 2 weeks right now. And one of the big challenges we're trying to determine is what's the highest and best use of a lot of money coming to us from the federal government. And we've got $1.5 billion of ARPA money right now. Just at the state, there's $8 billion running around the state in total, but there's more coming. I had a conversation with Senator Romney last week. There's another, billions and billions of dollars coming, some of which will be set aside for infrastructure. And so we're in discussions right now about how do we take some of that money and use it to bolster and strengthen our preparedness for natural disasters. So that's an important element that we're working on. But I would also say this, and I think this is not necessarily talked about enough. The other element of a disaster is how you adapt and respond once it occurs. And I don't think any state had the collaboration that Utah had between state and local leaders that we had over the last year, because you can't predict what exactly is going to happen when these roll in. But what we can do is ensure that the state and local leaders that deal with these things are working collaboratively together to adapt and do what's in the best interest of the state. And to me, that's probably the most important element in terms of resiliency when we talk about a disaster.
Unless Taylor or Nico would like to chime in, I'll
I
move.
would. Doug,
Yes,
if that's
please,
okay.
please do, Taylor.
Yeah,
Please
no,
do.
Thank you. And what I'd like to say is it's remarkable to me the change in prioritization that resilience has. Saying that a different way, the increased importance that resilience has in investors' underwriting of new opportunities in real estate and elsewhere over the last few years has been remarkable. It's been a significant change. Again, I work on behalf of global institutional investors, and it used to be 10 years ago that a sufficient answer for a physical risk or something like that was, oh, we have insurance for that. And I think long-term large investors are recognizing that insurance might not always be the answer or the panacea that we thought it was, as insurers are more and more impacted by natural disasters, including the pandemic. And so we're looking for, when we invest in a region or a city, plans, public-private plans to deal with some of these challenges, whether it's sea level rise in coastal areas or earthquakes and earthquake-prone areas, or even blizzards in areas that receive lots of snow. And pandemic has been added to the list for the last year. So this is of extreme importance for the fuel that has continued to drive Utah's economies as well, to see that these plans are being put in place.
Okay, Nico, I want to make sure we don't leave you out on this.
Yeah, let me just make a quick comment. A lot of the work that we do when we look at emerging technology is figuring out how it is that you can work in this world that is quickly changing. And if anything, the pandemic has only put more importance on that. So, absolutely funding and resources are tremendously important. But as was just mentioned in the speaker option, like figuring out how you plan with flexibility and how to be nimble is extremely important. That is one of the key aspects of resilience. So if previously we had done things where we would say like, well, let's plan, and we spend all this time planning and then say, okay, now the next 5 to 15 years is implementation. I mean, think about a plan that was created 3 years ago, 2 years ago, right? Like it seems almost bizarre that we would think that we would still be in the same implementation route, given everything that's changed with the pandemic. That volatility is going to continue. So instead of plan and implement, the cycle should really be much more now plan with a long-term target in mind, but then pilot pieces of this, figure out how you can be flexible, evaluate on the way, and then repeat with another pilot. So it's a really big shift in mindset, especially for government, that it's not simply plan and then, all right, now we got to make the thing happen, but really a continuous kind of feedback loop and figuring out how it is that you take in new information as these massive changes happen.
As Ari mentioned at the very beginning of our meeting today, our gathering, our spring breakfast, we have invited some questions from all of you as well, and several have come in on the chat. Well, quite a few have come in on the chat room. But this one intrigued us. What should Utah be doing to ensure our economy and environment are resilient against climate change? So maybe what are we doing and what should we be doing? And maybe we could start, Nico, since we just had you on. Let's start from Portland, Oregon. What is your view of Utah on this issue from there?
Okay, and completely understanding I am not from Utah, and so take it all with a grain of salt. But the biggest thing that we think about when we think about sustainable development over the long term, density and a shift in transportation modes, right? Density allows for everything, and density doesn't need to be New York City skyscrapers, these canyons within cities. There's a whole range of density that feels very comfortable. If any of you have been to a bunch of different cities, Portland actually has a fairly dense development. Lots of cities, obviously in Europe, that many of us go to vacation in and think that are glorious. That there's a whole range of density that is completely livable and feels great. And so figuring out models of density that feel good, that can maintain livability is probably the most important issue, which is a design question, a planning issue, zoning issue, obviously. And then figuring out and then allowing that to develop with all the fantastic transportation options that gives you is a key piece of it.
Maybe we could go to Taylor on this as well. Your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. And really, Doug, as soon as you asked the question, my mind started racing of all of the potential implications that climate change might have on Utah. I think, first of all, because you're not on a coast, you're not at sea level, many of these issues are going to be simpler to deal with than they are in many other cities in the United States and around the world. Nevertheless, a lot of these things are going to have to be thought through and addressed. And I like what the speaker said at the very beginning about the Stockdale paradox, looked at with clear, objective eyes and dealt with. What happens to the economic contributions of the skiing economy if the seasons are shorter in the future, as they're becoming? What kind of money do we have to allocate to wildfire prevention and fighting as well going forward? What kind of investments do we have to make in water infrastructure if droughts become longer in the future? And again, these are the types of things that global investors are looking at when they're looking at what markets they want to invest in. Are there plans about all of these things? Do the public policymakers, are they working to address them, or are they, hoping that these things don't come to pass? And hope is not an answer for those that are looking to invest in places at this point.
Natalie, if I could throw this to you, would appreciate your response.
Yeah, happy to do that. This is what I think of. I like to think of this nexus between air quality and climate change. And, the pollutants are different, but many of the interventions are the same, how we grow and our transportation solutions and the like. And I think that's a really helpful starting point. The legislature asked the Gardner Institute to look at this issue. We actually, in this case, came out with some recommendations. We were asked to do that. I think the state should be leading by example in their choice of what they do with efficiency in buildings and their transportation choices. We talked about Utah being the market-based electric vehicle state. And I think that has a lot of potential for our state and can do a lot of good there. And then third, there's others, but the third one I want to highlight is let's not leave the communities that are most impacted by these changes behind. And I'm speaking specifically of rural energy communities. The benefits of combating global climate change are widespread, but the costs are completely concentrated. And I think that's a really important point. Our Uinta Basin, our coal country, Carbon and Emery County, those are areas that need to diversify their economy as the market takes us away from fossil fuels. So those are just some quick observations that I think can be helpful.
Mr. Speaker, let's give you the last word on this particular topic.
Oh, thanks, Doug. The last word is complicated on something like this. And, Taylor said what I was going to start with. I just think we have to radically accept that the climate is warming. And I've lived here my whole life. This is not the same climate I grew up in. It's different. And we can argue all day long about the cause, but I just think we have to accept the fact that we have less water coming into the state. We have warmer temperatures. We have more fires. And all of those things have implications for life here, policymakers here, budgeting decisions here. And we've got to think through those. And it's a combination. There's no silver bullet. We've got to be better at conservation on water. We've got to think about developing the state's growth differently, which affects air quality, which affects natural resource consumption. And just radically accept that this is the world that we live in. And then also, I do agree with what Natalie said. I think that we've got to be good stewards and good examples as a state and figure out how to navigate this as best as we can, but do it in a balanced way. Do it in a way that still appreciates the private sector and innovation and keeps in mind the livelihoods of all citizens across the state. Not just a group in one specific area. And so there's a balancing act with all of these things, and we have to accept that. And I think we can. As has been mentioned earlier, there's probably no place in the country that's better at bringing stakeholders with wildly different perspectives and life stories together and trying to chart a course. And we're probably going to have to lean on Envision Utah to help us a little bit with that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A very, very important topic that's already come up a few times, just woven into some of the other things we've been discussing. But all of us here in the state of Utah are concerned about transportation. And we have been spoiled over the years to have great transportation and relatively smooth commutes. Many of us noticed a change over the last several decades, but especially over the last several years. The pandemic certainly brought different factors into that. Let's talk about transportation in the state of Utah, and especially with the pandemic itself, the effects on the economy, the effects on our patterns and the way we conduct business, even commerce. What do you anticipate with transportation, and are we doing enough right now to really focus on transportation? And Natalie, let's go to you first on this one.
Happy to do that, Doug. Thanks to Governor Herbert. I'm actually a commissioner on the Utah Department of Transportation Commission. So I have learned more about transportation in the last year than I did before. And what I would just want to impress, I'll let the other commentators speak more specifically to Doug's question, but I just don't think we are able to get in our heads how complex transportation is. And I know our guest from Oregon will echo that. If you think about the needs statewide for transportation, if you think about the safety issues, if you think about the maintenance issues, if you think about the new development, the new investment that has to occur, it's an enterprise that is, depending on how you define things, but probably one of the largest corporations, companies, businesses in our state to take care of how we move people and do it safely, efficiently, and carefully. And so I'm just going to put that out there and then let the other panelists respond to Doug's question, because in the backdrop, it is a big, big enterprise.
Nico, I think Natalie set it up for you to respond next. So let's go to Portland.
So yes, the complexity of transportation is enormous, and even more so right now, because of what we're seeing with how much the shifts in demand are tied to work from home, the growth that you are all seeing, e-commerce, like everything's in flux. And as I mentioned before, it is very much tied to development patterns. And some of the decisions, as I talk to people, I always say all of our individual personal decisions, which feel innocent, right? Oh, I'd love to live in this type of place or have, this much land or, this big of a yard. When you compound that across every person, in the state, every person in your metro region ends up having really severe implications. And so the part of the reality of it, and I think Utah is definitely, the Salt Lake area is definitely seeing this, that if we make choices individually that seem, okay and fine just for one person, but then you compound that across everyone, you end up having tremendous problems in terms of congestion. You end up having tremendous problems in terms of air quality. And to me, one of the key, there's kind of two areas that we can think about. One of them is really, and again, you've got enormous opportunities because of all the growth that you have coming towards you, which is shifts in development patterns and making sure that development patterns that support transportation modes that are not creating more greenhouse gas emissions, creating problems for air quality, and have opportunities for other types of transportation, and even the need to not move, right? If you live near something where you want to go, you don't have to get in your car, you can just walk over. So compact development, those types of things really have an opportunity. And then the other side is all sorts of new ideas about how transportation could be delivered. So everything from shared mobility, what will the role of Uber and Lyft be? Will autonomous vehicles arrive? All these types of things. Scooters, which I know that at least the Salt Lake area has a whole lot of. But with all that, in all the research that we've done and all the work that we've done and case studies that we've looked at across the globe, the most important thing that brings us back to really sustainable, limiting problems that you end up having with air quality is really transit has to be the backbone of all that. And again, that's all tied to development patterns.
Speaker Wilson, let's go to you.
Thanks, Doug. If you start to think about what's been some of the underpinnings of Utah's success, I think you could very easily come to the conclusion accurately that it's been investment in infrastructure. Whether you go back to the big investment in roads that was made prior to the Olympics, to some of our investment since then, it's really an important element to quality of life, to commerce, to growing the economy in a healthy way. And that's not going to change. I think what's getting trickier is what does that look like with new technologies developing, as well as something that's really weighing heavily on me and policymakers right now. And that's how are we going to pay for it? And just to give you some frame of reference, it doesn't seem like that long ago that we were in the Great Recession. Started really in 2007. That's 14 years ago. The largest auto manufacturer in the country is right now saying they're going to stop building internal combustion engines 14 years from now. And all of our infrastructure in terms of at least roads, most of it's paid for with a gas tax, which is a rapidly dying tax that won't pay for roads in the future. So this is probably more of a problem for me and policymakers here, but I think we all have to recognize that we're going to be paying for roads differently in 5 or 10 years than we pay for roads now as taxpayers. And if we don't figure that out as a state, our ability to fund infrastructure and to get out in front of the growth in the economy and the quality of life issues is in jeopardy. It's one of my biggest worries right now.
Taylor, let's get a quick response from you on this.
Yeah, sure. And the comments so far illustrate the complexity of the issue, but I think about traffic and transportation relatively simplistically, which is that there is no possible way to build your way out of traffic once it exists within a metropolitan region. That the traffic exists because people want to be there. So if you add more lanes to the freeway, that just simply allows more people to come and make that commute, and it facilitates development of new housing and so on. So this is what California has learned over the past 50 years: is it doesn't matter how many freeways you add, how many lanes you add to the freeways, how many cars you add to trains, you can't build your way out of it. The congestion is there. And so just going back to what Nico said, the primary intervention, there are lots of levers you can pull to mitigate things, but the primary intervention a region can make when it comes to reducing the overall costs, which are significant, of congestion, is through development patterns. And that's an area that Envision Utah has been focused on for years.
There are so many topics that we could be addressing today. I think we've hit some of the more important ones, but we have also left a couple on the sideline that I'm already feeling guilty about. And perhaps we could even, we want to be respectful of everyone's time today, and we are nearing the end, and it's time for closing comments from our panelists. And we so appreciate them joining us today and being able to tap into their expertise. But if I could ask a personal favor of you as you do weave your final comments, rural Utah is Governor Cox, Governor Herbert, all of our preceding governors have really expressed a real desire now with the great economy we've had along the Wasatch Front, particularly. Natalie mentioned the challenges we have in some of our communities with everything from recreation to energy and climate change. So if you wouldn't mind, that I'd appreciate that as a personal favor. In your closing statements, if you would weave that in. And let's do this one in reverse order from where we actually started. So perhaps, Mr. Speaker, we could start with you on this.
Yeah, happy to start. Well, I appreciate the invitation to be here today. These are important topics, and I love talking about these big issues that the state is facing. And I love also talking about rural Utah as a way to end this. There's tremendous opportunity for our friends and neighbors in rural Utah. I pull together regularly all of our rural Utah lawmakers and talk about the challenges that they face and what they'd like to see happen in their communities. And the pandemic is one of those really disruptive forces and times that I think has got our rural Utah partners thinking differently about how they provide good paying jobs for their communities, and also how we think about investment in their communities. Historically, rural Utah has been very reliant on energy and tourism. I think that those will continue to be important for rural Utah, but we also need to think about how we can continue to support them in their innovation to bring other technologies and companies and businesses to their communities. One thing the state is doing actively is massive investment in broadband infrastructure, in particular for rural Utah, so that we can support individuals not just growing up in rural Utah, but staying in rural Utah as the workforce evolves into the future. So I think the story is still to be written completely, Doug, but lots of really interesting things going on in that space.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Taylor Mammen, maybe you could give us a comment, closing comment, and weave rural Utah into it.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. And one of the words that's appeared in the conversation repeatedly and that kind of stuck in my mind for the closing comment is resilience. That Utah is a fantastic place to be. It has greater fundamentals than many, many other parts of the country as well as the world, and has a bright future to it. And that in order to maintain that, in order to make sure those drivers are resilient, doesn't mean doing the same thing the way that things have always been done, but rather to change, continue change, as Nico was pointing out when it comes to planning. It's you work on something, you implement it, you make course adjustments, and it's a continuous process of change. And that is what's necessary for rural Utah as well. I have lots of family members that live in rural Utah. I've spent a lot of time in rural Utah over the past year, and so I've thought about it a lot. And the way to preserve a lot of these communities isn't by continuing to do things the same way they've always been done, to rely on the same economic drivers, for example, even if they might be there for a while, but to continue to pivot and change, make these new places, which is what every great place does.
Nico, Larco, let's go back up to Portland for your final thoughts.
Yeah, I think echoing the comments that were just made, really, I think nimbleness is resilience, right? I think that is like the key idea here. And there's tons of opportunities and tons of challenges that rural Utah, rural areas everywhere in the country are facing and will continue to face, with continue need resources, but what are the opportunities with remote work? With more and more interest in recreation? And the question is going to be, if you are continuing to do the same thing when the world around you is changing, and I would say this for rural areas and for urban areas, that is a problem. It is a tremendous risk to maintain the status quo when the world around you shifts. And so like the who can innovate, how can you be nimble, that really nimbleness is resilience. And also part of that is being aware of and accepting the reality that some things are changing. And, being a rock in front of this unstoppable force probably isn't going to wear well. Figuring out how it is that you can move with it and help shape those things that are coming. That is where I think the real successes are going to be.
Nico, thank you. And Natalie Gochnour, we'll let you have the final word.
Thank you, Doug. Great to be with everyone. I think of rural Utah as part of the solution, the people, the resources. And so I think it's the right thing to always have them in every conversation and find ways for rural Utah to be part of the solution. I also think that the future is not a gift, but really an achievement. It's something that we purposefully create. A colleague of mine says it's not some planet we land on, right? We get to shape and create the future that we have. And so as we do that, let's be thinking about how to create the future worthy of our time and attention and that we can have affection for. And I'll just plant one seed. I think that we should be thinking very seriously about how do we invest in our institutions that shape us, that form us, that keep us prosperous. And as we do that, it's a time to build. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And boy, thank you to our panelists who have joined us here in studio, and also, of course, Nico up there in Portland. We really appreciate the expertise and the great thoughts and ideas that we've heard today. And thank you so much for those who have been joining us. And right now we want to turn things over to Melissa Langford, who is with us at Envision Utah for some final thoughts. Melissa?
Hi, I'm Melissa Langford. I'm the development director. Thank you to Doug and our panelists for such an insightful and incredible discussion. Thank you to our generous sponsors who made this event possible. And thanks to all of you guys who joined virtually today to listen and learn. We will have a recording of this event available on our website, hopefully later this week. So be on the lookout for that. And really, 2020 has been a challenging year, and it's changed what we can expect from our future. And with this discussion, it's clear that we're going to have to think creatively and work together to shape that future. And we hope you'll be able to join us in our efforts to do so. You can sign up for our newsletter, you can follow us on social media, or you can get involved in projects individually. You can also support us financially as well. We don't hold these events to be major fundraisers for Envision Utah. That's why many of you are here on a free or discounted ticket. And instead, we hold them really to bring the community together to talk about and think about these long-term critical issues, to collaborate, to peer into the future like we did today. So after these events, though, there are still lots of things to do. And I want to invite you all to take a moment to support Envision Utah in any way you can. And you can do so at envisionutah.org/donate. And really, thanks again for being here. Thanks for joining us and supporting our work. And hopefully we'll be able to see you maybe in person later this year at our Common Good Awards.